I didn't think this would actually happen to me, but it did. You spend $2,000, maybe more, on a flagship OLED because every reviewer, including me sometimes, says it's the absolute pinnacle of picture quality. Perfect blacks, infinite contrast. And it is perfect, right up until you leave a news channel on for too long, or you try to watch a football game in a living room that actually has windows. Then you start noticing the screen dimming itself to prevent overheating. Or worse, you see that faint ghost-like logo burned into the corner of your panel. Permanently. Hi, this is Chris Walker. And look, I'll be honest with you. I love OLED, but for about 80% of normal people watching TV in normal, bright living rooms, it's the wrong technology. Actually, wait, let me rephrase that. It's an expensive mistake because right now there are 5 Mini-LED TVs on the market that have gotten so good, the algorithms are so precise, the brightness is so intense that they completely fix the OLED problem. No burn-in anxiety, no aggressive dimming, just raw, usable performance. Before we tear into the actual engineering and figure out which of these panels isn't just marketing hype, do me a favor. Hitting the like button and subscribing is the only way we keep these reviews independent and based on real testing and not brand sponsorships. Okay, let's look at what's actually happening behind the glass. Here's what's actually happening. When you walk into a big box electronics store, the entire layout, the lighting, the aisle placement, and demo footage is literally designed to lie to you. They run these flagship OLEDs in what they call vivid mode, sitting under massive fluorescent warehouse lights, playing custom-rendered slow-motion footage of honey dripping off a spoon or bright, colorful paint exploding against a black background. And it looks absolutely flawless. But then you get it home.
Think about the last time you tried to watch a dark, heavily graded show like House of the Dragon or The Batman at 2 in the afternoon on a Saturday. Your living room has windows. Maybe you have a sliding glass door letting in the afternoon sun. Suddenly, that $2,000 OLED turns into a very expensive, very dark mirror. You can see the reflection of your own couch and your coffee table better than the actual dragon on the screen. So you end up doing what we all do. You get up, draw the curtains, pull the blinds, and turn your house into a cave just to use your TV. That's a problem, but the bigger problem, the one nobody tells you about until the return window is closed, is the physics of OLED itself. Every single pixel on an OLED generates its own light and its own color. That is amazing for absolute black levels, because a pixel can just turn completely off, pitch black. But what happens when you watch a hockey game or a bright, snowy nature documentary? You are asking millions of organic pixels to drive maximum white light all at the exact same time, and that generates heat, a lot of it. If the TV allowed that to happen for too long, the organic compounds would literally cook themselves. So the TV panics. It uses a safety mechanism called an auto brightness limiter, or ABL. The processor aggressively steps in and chokes the power, visibly dimming the entire screen to protect the panel. You're sitting there watching a hockey game, and every time the camera pans across the ice, the picture gets duller and grayer. It is incredibly distracting once you notice it. And let's talk about the burn-in elephant in the room. Manufacturers will swear up and down that they have pixel shifting technology, they have logo dimming algorithms, they run compensation cycles when you turn the TV off. And yes, all of that helps delay the inevitable, but it does not change the fundamental chemistry of the panel. If you are someone who works from home and leaves a financial news channel ticking at the bottom of the screen, or you play a game with a static heads-up display for 4 hours a night, that organic material is degrading at an uneven rate. Period. The pixels rendering that bright red news ticker are aging faster than the pixels rendering the dark background. Over time, that leaves a permanent ghost-like shadow. You spend your hard-earned money to relax, and instead you end up babying your TV. You find yourself picking up the remote to change the channel during a bathroom break because you're terrified of leaving a static image on the screen. That is not a premium ownership experience. That is a hostage situation. Which brings us to Mini-LED. This isn't just a marketing buzzword, it's a brute force engineering solution. Manufacturers took a traditional LCD screen, but instead of lighting it from the edges with a few cheap strips of LEDs, they packed thousands of microscopic high-intensity LED flashlights directly behind the panel. Then they grouped those tiny lights into zones that can turn on and off independently. But here's the catch, and I almost ignored this when I first started testing these, and that would have been a massive mistake. The number of dimming zones doesn't matter nearly as much as the brain controlling them. A TV with 5,000 zones and a trash processor will look significantly worse than a TV with 1,000 zones and elite software. Which is exactly why the first TV we need to talk about is the TCL QM7, or the QM751G, depending on which retailer's box you're looking at. Look, I'll be honest with you, I usually don't expect much from a 65-inch TV that often goes on sale for under $1,000. You usually have to make a painful compromise somewhere. Either the interface is a sluggish mess, or the panel looks like a cloudy, dirty window during fast camera pans. But the QM7 is where the entire market gets flipped upside down. TCL claims this thing hits 2,400 nits of peak brightness with over 1,500 local dimming zones. Now, I never trust box specs, so we put a colorimeter on it in the studio. In a calibrated 10% window, watching real HDR movie content, it actually maxed out around 1,800 nits. Actually, wait, let me put that number into perspective, because nits is a meaningless spec to most people. 1,800 nits is retina-searing. If you put on the 4K Blu-ray of Top Gun Maverick, specifically the scene toward the end where they're flying low through that snowy mountain canyon, when the sunlight glints off the canopy of the fighter jet, it is so intensely bright that it physically makes you squint. You can literally feel the intensity of the backlight pushing into the room. It easily overpowers the ambient daylight from my studio windows. An OLED from 2 years ago couldn't even dream of pushing that kind of sustained full-screen punch. And the black levels? Surprisingly great. In the Osaka hotel sequence in John Wick 4, where you have those blazing neon signs set against the pitch-black night sky, the QM7's dimming algorithm handles it beautifully. The blacks are inky. But I noticed something strange here. This is where the budget reality checks in. TCL used a VA panel. VA panels are fantastic for deep native contrast, but their physical structure has a massive weakness: viewing angles. If you are sitting dead center on your couch, staring straight down the barrel of this TV, it looks like a flagship. The illusion is perfect. But get up and walk to the kitchen, or sit in that recliner off to the far side of the room. The second you move off axis, even just 30 degrees to the left or right, the contrast completely washes out. And worse, you start seeing this weird, faintly purple or bluish halo around bright objects. It's called blooming. From the side, you can literally see the square dimming zones lighting up behind the glass. So if you have a wide U-shaped seating arrangement in your living room where people sit at sharp angles, this TV will cause immediate buyer's remorse for the people sitting on the edges. And there's another physical reality I didn't expect: the heat and the hardware build. When you unbox this thing, the back panel is this checkerboard plastic. It feels a little hollow, and after I had it running a bright HDR benchmark loop for about 2 hours, I muted the speakers, and you could actually hear the plastic chassis giving off these tiny creaks and pops. It's just thermal expansion from the sheer amount of heat those 1,500 mini LEDs are generating. It's not dangerous, but it is a physical reminder that you are pushing a massive amount of energy through a budget-friendly frame. Also, the ports. This drives me absolutely insane. If you're a gamer, you see 144 Hz and HDMI 2.1 on the box and you get excited. But turn the TV around and look at the actual board. There are 4 HDMI ports, but only 2 of them are high bandwidth 2.1 ports capable of 4K gaming at high frame rates. And here's the kicker: one of those 2 high-speed ports is also the eARC port. Let's play this out in the real world. You buy a PlayStation 5. You plug it into port 1. Great. Now you want to plug in your Dolby Atmos soundbar. The TV forces you to plug the soundbar into the eARC port, which is your only other gaming port. If you buy an Xbox Series X later, you're out of luck.
You have to plug it into a standard 60 Hz port or start crawling behind your entertainment center to physically swap cables every time you want to play a different console. It is a completely unnecessary bottleneck that TCL used to save probably $3 in licensing fees. The software experience is a bit of a mixed bag, too. It runs Google TV, which I vastly prefer over Samsung's cluttered operating system, but the processor inside, the AIPQ Pro, is clearly prioritizing the picture quality algorithms over the user interface. When you press the home button on the remote, which by the way has a really nice heavy click to it, and it's backlit, which I appreciate, but when you click it, you wait. It's just a fraction of a second, maybe a half second of menu lag, but it's there. It doesn't glide the way a dedicated Apple TV 4K does.
But look, for what this thing costs, if your main priority is getting an absurdly bright, punchy, cinematic picture for movie nights, and you sit relatively centered, the QM7 essentially breaks the price to performance curve. It proves that you do not need to spend $2,000 to get premium HDR impact. Before we get into the Hisense and how it completely tries to brute force this exact same problem, drop a comment down below and let me know what specific TV, soundbar, or tech category you want me to put on the test bench next. I actually read those, and it heavily dictates what we buy with our own money for the studio. Because if the TCL is what you get as the baseline, what happens when you decide to throw another few $100 at the problem? This next one is where the math actually starts to make sense for a lot of people, but it's also where the firmware gets incredibly deceptive. So if you step up from that baseline, you immediately run into the Hisense U8N. On paper, this TV looks like a mistake by the manufacturer, like they accidentally put their flagship $3,000 tech into a mid-range chassis and just forgot to charge you for it. They claim completely absurd numbers on the box, and honestly, when we put the colorimeter on it in the studio, it actually backed them up. We measured over 3,000 nits of peak brightness in HDR. That is not just bright, that is the kind of bright that makes you physically blink if an explosion happens on screen in a dark room. But here's what they do not put on the spec sheet: the processor. Or more specifically, the absolute nightmare that is their firmware. I had the U8N set up and I spent a good 2 hours dialing in the calibration for standard 4K content. It looked phenomenal. The contrast was punchy, the local dimming was aggressively crushing the letterbox bars into pure black. I was genuinely impressed. Then I switched over to a Dolby Vision movie on Netflix. The color mapping completely fell apart. The flesh tones on the actors' faces literally shifted from warm to a sickly cold and back to warm in the exact same scene. It was like the TV's brain was panicking, constantly recalculating what it was supposed to be doing with the metadata. And then the interface froze. Not just a minor stutter. I mean a hard system-level lockup where the remote completely stopped working. I physically had to walk behind the entertainment center, pull the power cord from the wall, wait 10 seconds, and reboot the television. That is not a premium ownership experience. It feels like Hisense paired a Ferrari engine with a transmission made of cheap plastic. You're constantly fighting the TV to get that perfect picture. I also had this recurring EARC bug where my soundbar would just stop receiving audio. I'd turn the TV on, sit down with my coffee, and get dead silence. I had to unplug the HDMI cable and plug it back in just to force a digital handshake every single day. Look, if you are a tinkerer who doesn't mind diving into Reddit forums to find backdoor firmware patches via USB drives, and yes, that is a real thing Hisense owners have to do, the raw hardware value here is undeniable. But if you just want to turn on your TV and have it work, skip the Hisense. Which brings me to the TCL QM851G. This is essentially the TV you buy if you want that overwhelming spec sheet shattering performance, but you actually want the software to function. TCL stepped up their processing this year with the AIPQ Pro chip, and the difference in daily stability is night and day compared to Hisense. They advertise 5,000 nits. Now, in the real world, you are never going to see that unless you force the TV into an uncalibrated, unnatural vivid mode, which makes human beings look like radioactive lobsters. But even in a color-accurate movie mode, it easily clears 3,000 nits. But here is where things get weird. Because it's pushing so much light, the local dimming algorithm has to work overtime to prevent blooming. And TCL's approach to this is aggressive. Instead of risking a faint halo around a bright object, the QM8 will sometimes just crush the surrounding shadow detail entirely. You'll be watching a dark, moody scene, think the Batman, and his suit just disappears into a wall of flat black. It's a trade-off. You get incredible OLED-like black levels, but you lose a little bit of the artistic detail in the shadows. Also, we need to talk about the physical reality of the panel again. It is still a VA panel. They improved the viewing angle slightly from the cheaper QM7, but it is still fundamentally directional. If you have a long, narrow living room where everyone sits directly in front of the screen, you are golden. But if you mount this high above a fireplace, please don't do that, by the way, it ruins your neck. Or if you have a wide L-shaped sectional couch, the people sitting on the far edges are going to get a vastly inferior picture. The colors wash out, and because you're looking at the Mini-LED grid from an angle, all that blooming control we just talked about, it completely falls apart. You will see glowing squares around subtitles. So what if you have a wide room? What if you have a sun-drenched living room with bay windows, and you need something that fixes the viewing angles and handles reflections without aggressively crushing shadow detail? That is where the math starts pushing you towards Samsung, specifically the QN90D. I have a very complicated love-hate relationship with Samsung TVs, but structurally, physically, the QN90D is built like a tank. Samsung uses an IPS-style panel in a lot of these sizes, but they combine it with an incredibly advanced anti-reflective layer and a wide viewing film. And I cannot overstate how much of a physical difference this makes in a real home. If you shine a flashlight directly at the TCL or the Hisense, you get a sharp, defined, blinding reflection of the bulb. If you shine it at the Samsung QN90D, the light just diffuses. It spreads out into this soft, manageable glow.
If you watch Sunday afternoon football in a room with open blinds, this is practically the only safe option before you start spending $3 or $4 grand. And for gamers, the hardware layout is flawless. You get 4 full bandwidth HDMI 2.1 ports, no eARC sacrifice like on the budget models. You can plug in a PlayStation 5, an Xbox Series X, a gaming PC, and a high-end Atmos soundbar, and you never have to crawl behind the TV to swap a cable again. Plus, the input lag is virtually non-existent. It is a wildly responsive display. But, and this is a massive, frustrating but for me, we have to talk about Tizen OS. I honestly do not understand what Samsung software engineers are doing right now. A few years ago, they had this brilliant, unobtrusive little dock that would pop up at the bottom of the screen. You could launch Netflix or YouTube without interrupting whatever you were currently watching. It was elegant. They killed it. Now, every time you press the home button, it aggressively yanks you out of your movie and forces you into this full-screen, cluttered, ad-heavy dashboard. And it lags. It actually stutters when you scroll through the menus. It is infuriating. And if you dare to change a picture setting, say you want to switch from eco mode to filmmaker mode because you actually want the movie to look the way the director intended, Samsung throws up this incredibly annoying pop-up warning you about energy consumption, and you have to manually click to dismiss it every single time. You spend nearly $2,000 on a premium piece of technology, and the software treats you like you don't know how to operate a television. Oh, and there's the other elephant in the room with Samsung. They flat out refuse to pay the licensing fee for Dolby Vision. Every other manufacturer on the planet supports Dolby Vision. Samsung stubbornly sticks to their own competing format, HDR10+. Now, does the QN90D get bright enough that standard HDR10 still looks incredible? Yes, absolutely. But if you watch a ton of Netflix, Disney Plus, or Apple TV Plus, platforms that rely heavily on Dolby Vision's dynamic metadata to perfectly balance highlights and shadows, scene by scene, you are simply locked out of that layer of optimization.
Actually, you know what the easiest fix for the Samsung is? If you love the hardware, and you should, the panel is spectacular for bright rooms. Just buy a $50 Apple TV 4K or a Roku Ultra, plug it into HDMI 1, connect that to your Wi-Fi, and never ever connect the Samsung TV directly to the internet. Just bypass Tizen entirely. It solves 90% of the daily friction of owning this TV. So we've looked at the brute force budget option, the spec monster with firmware issues, the balanced mid-tier, and the bright room premium king. But none of those completely replicate the pure, inky black cinematic perfection of an OLED. They get close, but there is always a slight compromise, whether it's minor blooming, crushed shadows, or viewing angles. If you want zero compromises, if you want to completely eliminate OLED from the conversation without losing an ounce of cinematic accuracy, there is one TV left. And honestly, it might be the most impressive piece of consumer tech I've tested this entire decade. The Sony Bravia 9. I want to be very clear about what this is because the price tag is aggressive. You're paying OLED money, sometimes more than OLED money, for an LED television. For a lot of people, that sounds insane, but then you pull it out of the box. Actually, wait, before you even pull it, you realize this is not a normal TV. The 75-inch model weighs over 90 pounds without the stand attached. It is thick, it is incredibly heavy. When you look at it from the side, it almost looks like a throwback to TVs from 10 years ago because the chassis is nearly 2 inches deep. There is a physical reason for that. Sony didn't just pack this thing with standard mini-LEDs. They engineered an entirely new, ridiculously tiny 22-bit driver to control the backlight. It's a miniaturized version of the exact same technology they use in their $30,000 professional Hollywood mastering monitors. So what does that actually mean when you sit down on your couch? It means the TV knows exactly how to handle light. I put on the 4K Blu-ray of Dune Part 2. In the scenes where you have the blazing desert sun against the dark Fremen still suits, the Bravia 9 does something that no other LED TV has ever been able to do in my studio. The letterbox bars at the top and bottom of the movie stay pitch perfect black. Not gray, not a glowing milky dark blue, black. And there is zero blooming, none. I paused a scene with pure white subtitles on a completely black background, got up from the couch and walked right up to the glass. I couldn't find a halo. But I did notice something strange here, and this is where that physical thickness comes back into play. Because it's an LED, it still has viewing angle limitations compared to an OLED. If you walk entirely to the side of the room, you will start to see the contrast lift just a tiny bit. It's physics, but from anywhere in a normal seating arrangement, it is flawless. And the motion handling. Sony's XR processor is basically black magic at this point. If you watch a lot of standard cable, Sunday football, live news, or even older 1080p YouTube videos, this processor takes that compressed, messy signal and cleans it up so well you'd swear it was a native 4K broadcast. No weird stuttering when a football goes spiraling through the air, just smooth, cinematic motion. Even the remote feels lived in. It's got a solid weight, the buttons are backlit, which is a godsend in a dark theater room, and it has a built-in finder function. It just feels like a tool designed for adults, not a plastic toy. So where does all of this leave us? Let me pull back and break this down, because you do not need to spend Bravia 9 money to fix your living room. If you are on a strict budget, but you want that massive, punchy, modern HDR experience, buy the TCL QM7. Yes, the menus stutter a little. Yes, the viewing angles are narrow. But for the money, the raw hardware output is untouchable. If you have a bright living room, maybe a wide couch, and you do a lot of heavy gaming, the Samsung QM90D is your workhorse. Just do yourself a massive favor and buy a dedicated streaming box so you never have to fight with Samsung's built-in software. But if you are that person who has been staring at an OLED in a Best Buy, terrified of burn-in but refusing to compromise on black levels or cinematic accuracy, the Sony Bravia 9 is the answer. It is the OLED killer we've been waiting for. Look, here is the absolute truth about the TV market right now.
Most people buy OLED out of pure FOMO. They're told it's the best, so they buy it, and then they drop it into a sun-drenched living room where it spends the next 5 years aggressively dimming itself to survive. That makes zero sense. You need to buy the panel that fits the reality of your room, not the reality of a showroom floor. I've put links down in the description to the exact vetted models we talked about today. I highly recommend using those specific links, not just to support the channel, but because TV manufacturers are notorious for quietly swapping out panel types in the middle of a production year. The links below point to the specific hardware revisions we actually verified and tested. Don't buy a TV that forces you to live in the dark. Buy one that actually works for you. I'm Chris Walker. I'll see you in the next one.